A gute Woche. The Rebbe soll gesund sein began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is Shabbos Parshas Terumah. And this is the Seder where we are told the Pasuk Va'osu li mikdash v'shachanti b'soicham. Famous Pasuk where the Rebbe says that the Yidden should make a Mishkan, and later it was called the Mikdash, and the Mishkan and the Mikdash are the same, and that is where the Rebbe will dwell. B'shachanti b'soicham, he will dwell amongst them. And we all know the famous Chazal, b'soichoi loi nemar ela b'soicham. It does not say that the Rebbe will dwell in it, in the Mishkan or in the Mikdash, but rather amongst them, meaning that the Rebbe dwells, the Shechina dwells amongst each and every Yid. And interesting, it was later in the Farbrengen, in fact it was in the Maimer, the Rebbe also quoted this Chazal, that the Shechina, v'shachanti b'soicham, that the Rebbe is dwelling b'soich kol echad ve'echad, and this is how we usually quote this Chazal. The Rebbe says, but nowadays, we have to quote it not b'soich kol echad ve'echad, but b'soich kol echad ve'achas. Meaning, by each and every one, male and female. It says years ago there may have not been a need to stress this, but the truth is that women are mechuyev in all of these inyanim, just like women are mechuyev in the mitzvahs timidiyas, meaning in mitzvahs which we have to do them constantly, primarily avas Hashem and yiras Hashem. It's the famous minchas chinuch which the Rebbe referred to today, where the Minchas Chinuch explains that there are the constant mitzvahs timidiyas, which women are mechuyev to do, just like men. And just like we find, the Rebbe says in Aseres HaDibros, the Rebbe speaks, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, and he speaks Lashon Yachid to every Yid, and it's expressed in a Lashon Zachar, but nonetheless we know that the Rebbe refers to men and the Rebbe refers to women as well. The same when we are talking in this inyan of Va'asuli Mishkan v'shachanti b'soicham, and there's the famous Chazal that stresses that the Shechina dwells within each and every Yid. It's b'soich kol echad ve'achas. Each and every one, male and female, are capable of making their homes that they should be suitable, that the Shechina should dwell there. Getting back to our inyan. Getting back to the beginning of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to the famous Maimer, Bossi Legani, which was written by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and was given out by the Frierdiker Rebbe to be learned on the Shabbos, which turned out to be his first Yom Hilula, his first Yortzeit. This is where the Maimer Bossi Legani originally began. This is a Maimer which was written by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted it published for the Shabbos Parshas Boi of Yud Shvat in the year that he passed away, because Yud Shvat is the Yortzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe's grandmother, Rebbetzin Rivke, the Rebbetzin of the Rebbe Maharash. So for that Shabbos, he published the Maimer, gave out the Maimer of beginning with Bossi Legani. In the Maimer of Bossi Legani, the Rebbe continues, there the Frierdiker Rebbe explains at length this entire concept of the Shechina coming down into this world, and where he also refers that it was Moshe Rabbeinu who was the Shvi, who was the seventh from the Ovis, and Kol HaShviin Chavivin, all sevenths are dear, and he was the one that brought the Shechina from the first Rikiah, from the first heaven, brought down the Shechina unto this world. So it was actually through Moshe Rabbeinu that the entire concept of Va'asuli Mikdash v'shachanti b'soicham was fulfilled. Who was the one that channeled all this, and through whom did all of this go? It went through Moshe Rabbeinu. Especially today. Today is one day, in other words, Shabbos was one day before Zayin Adar. And Zayin Adar is a day which is closely associated with Moshe Rabbeinu, because that is his birthday, and that is the day that he passed away. And as Chazal tell us that a tzaddikim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu memalish neseim miyom liyoim, that by tzaddikim the Rebishter gives them their lives, that it should be in a way that they have a full amount of years, meaning that their yortzeit, the day that they pass away, is the same day that they were born. And we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu's yortzeit, which is tomorrow, and we know that the greatness of an Indian of a yortzeit, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that a tzaddik on the day of his yortzeit is poyel Yeshua, is beker of ha'aretz, accomplishes tremendous assistance for everyone, tremendous Yeshua's, tremendous help. And especially when we're talking about a yortzeit of a person like Moshe Rabbeinu. So this inyan of va'asuli mikdash v'shechanti b'soicham, and the fact that this was channeled through Moshe Rabbeinu, and the fact that today we are talking about all of this, when this is a day before Moshe Rabbeinu's yortzeit and Yom Heledes, all of these inyanim have a strong shaychus one with another. Referring to the inyan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu memale by tzaddikim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives them that their birthday and the Yom Hilula is on the same day. This is what the Gemara says. Rabbi mentioned a few interesting things. We find in the Gemara tells us, B'shas Haman wanted Chas v'Sholem to had in mind his decree, which he wanted to see on Yidden. So Haman was hippel pul. He was making lots, he was making goyrels. And for when did it come out? It came out for the month of Adar. So the Gemara says that he was very happy. Why? Because he thought that the month of Adar is a sad month for Yidden. Because he was aware that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away in the month of Adar, so it's something sad. And the Gemara immediately continues, Lo yada, he didn't know that Moshe Rabbeinu was also born on this month, on the same day in fact. So the Rebbe asked, Haman was not alone, he had chachamim, he had wise people that were with him, that were helping him. How can we say that they knew of Moshe Rabbeinu's passing in the month of Adar, and they didn't know that he was born in the month of Adar? The Rebbe says that this is an indication that Taka, until the Gemara tells us about it, Taka, it was something which was not known to people. People knew that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away on Zayin Adar, and people, Taka, did not know. It was an unaware thing. It wasn't a familiar thing. It wasn't a publicized thing. Just like we have the expression that there's an inyan of Kol Masha Talmid Vosik Osid Lachadish. This Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, and this Torah includes everything which all later generations are going to introduce in Torah, are going to be Mechadish in Torah. So this inyan was also something which it seems like previous generations Taka were not aware of it and did not know about it. And it was Taka later that they found out that not only did Moshe Rabbeinu pass away in the month of Adar, but Moshe Rabbeinu was also born in the month of Adar. Talking about this same minyan, the Rebbe asks, though we see that there are many tzaddikim, and we don't notice by them the inyan that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be memalish neseim miyom liyoim. We see that their yortzeit is on one day and their birthday is on a different day. The Rebbe says this perhaps could be explained with the concept of Gilgulim. In other words, we know that the neshamas that come down now into this world, this neshama was already on this world previously. And now it's coming down again to fulfill a yonah which the neshama did not complete previously. This is one of the most fundamental things in Emunah, is to believe in the concept of Gilgul. The Mela, the Rebbe says, that could be based on the idea of Gilgulim, it is coming out to be Miyom Liyoim. In other words, the day that he's passing away now may be the birthday of the Neshama in a previous Gilgul, or vice versa. Talking about this in the Rebbe also mentioned a very Gishmaket Haich. There's the famous Mishnah that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, Harei Aniki ben Shivim Shana. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was only 18, and he was appointed to be a Nasi, and he expressed himself, I am, as if I would be already 70 years old. So we all know the famous Gemara that in order that everybody should have respect for him, HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed the miracle, his beard turned white. He looked like a Kiben Shivim Shana, but he really wasn't Shivim Shana. So the Rebbe brought today a Taich that what does it mean, Harei Ani Kiben Shivim Shana? It means in continuation with a Gilgul of a previous neshama who was already down in this world. The Rebbe mentioned Shmuel Hanavi. And Shmuel Hanavi lived for 52 years. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah at this time was 18 years old. So 52 and 18 is 70. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah expressed himself, Harei ani ki ben shivim shana. How was he 70 years, taking in consideration his years on this world, plus the calculation of the years of whose neshama he is a Gilgal. The Rebbe says this. There is, however, one question regarding the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, we know that the Baal Shem Tov expressed himself that the Alter Rebbe is a neshama chadosha. The Alter Rebbe is a new soul, a soul that was never down in this world yet. Memela, regarding the Alter Rebbe, we can't give any interpretation of Gilgal because the Alter Rebbe was a neshama chadosha. So the question remains, where do we find the inyan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu memalish neseim shel tzadikim miyoyim liyoyim by the Alter Rebbe? Getting back to our inyan, this all came, as the Rebbe himself referred to it, he didn't answer it. This all came, as the Rebbe himself referred to it, as a maimah hamuzga. In other words, it's in parentheses, being that he mentioned this inyan, one inyan led to another. Now getting back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu's inyan was to bring the Shekhinah down into this world. And we find that when the Yidden were in the Midbar, we find that their survival in the Midbar, the Medrash tells us, they had the water, they had in the merit of Miriam. The clouds, the protection of the clouds, they had in the merit of Aaron. And the man, which was a lechem min hashamayim, which was a godly food, a heavenly food, this they had in the merit of Moshe. Why do we find after Aaron and Miriam passed away, these things did not stop for the Yidden? The Yidden had it regardless. How? Then they had all of this in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu. What does all of this show us? Rabbi explains, there is Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moshe Rabbeinu stands in his own madrege, and there are additional inyanim within Moshe. These three areas of Mon and the Ananim, the clouds, and also the water, the Be'er Shel Miriam, these are the three kavim, the three famous pillars which the world rests on. Mayim, coming from a Be'er, this is the inyan of Chesed. Vaita Aaron, in whose merits were the clouds, the protection of the clouds. Aaron's inyan is, as we all know, the inyan to serve in the Mishkan and was Makriv Karbonis. His inyan was Avodah. And Torah was Moshe's inyan, as the expression goes, Zichu Torah's Moshe Avdi, the Torah of Moshe, and Chazal tell us, Shemasar Nafshela, that Moshe sacrificed himself for Torah. And that is why he was rewarded that the Torah is being called on his name. Memela. So we have Moshe in his own madrege, and we have Moshe as Moshe encompasses within him the other madreges of the other royim, the Ashloisha royim. There were three shepherds to Yidden, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. There is Moshe as he stands in his own madrege, and there is Moshe as he stands in the madrege where he encompasses within himself all the three levels of himself, Aaron, and Miriam. Same the Rebbe says we find in the Mishkan. In the Mishkan we find the general idea of the Mishkan. For Osuli Mikdash v'Shechanti b'Soicha, which there's only one tzivui in the Torah, one commandment in the Torah as far as making the Mishkan. However, in the Mishkan itself, there were various areas. There was the Orein, and we all know the Shitta of the Ramban, who claims that the main inyan of the Mishkan, the main inyan of the Beis HaMikdash was the Orein, and what was housed in the Orein? The Orein had within himself the Luchais, the inyan of Torah. As well we have the inyan of Avodah. Is obvious how it was in the Mishkan. That's the whole inyan of Karbanos. And then we also have the inyan of Chesed. In the Mishkan, this the Rebbe explained, this is the Hashpois, how the Beis HaMikdash, and prior to that the Mishkan, served as a protector for the entire world. And it was a source of blessing for the entire world. Source of bracha. So Mamela, through this we see how the Mishkan had, again, all the three kavim, the inyan of Torah, Avodah, and Milas Chasadim. So we have the main inyan of the Mishkan, which is the inyan of Asuli Mishkan v'Shechanti b'Soicham, the inyan klali, the general idea, how the Mishkan brings to the revelation of godliness into this world, and then we have in the Mishkan itself the details of Torah, Avodah, and Milas Chasadim. And here the Rebbe also quoted the famous Chazal on the pasuk v'yikhu li Terumah. So Chazal tell us, Kol mokem shenemar li, wherever we find an expression of li, einay zos misham la'olam, it's an expression of eternity. So Memela here, when we're talking about the Mishkan and the Mikdash, so Rabbi referred to the Inyanim which he's been talking about recently. We had the physical Beis HaMikdash and the physical Mishkan. However, now we are left with the Inyanim as they are spiritually, and this is something which is B'koyach, which is within the power of each and every one of us, adults and as well as children, that every child can make his table and his bed, that it should be a source for a revelation of godliness. As the Rebbe wrote in the famous letters, that by every child having a siddur of his own, and a chumash of his own, and a tzedakah pushka of his or her own, and same the other things, side the boys and side the girls, by having these things and by utilizing them. The Rebbe also mentioned, he wrote it in the letters and he mentioned it today, that it is the obligation of the mechanchim of the children from time to time to question the children and see to it that the children can have all these things and put them to use. The Rebbe added today that when those who are involved in educating the children will know that they have a responsibility to check by the children if the children are using these things properly. It says, being that everything that's done in chinuch and everything that's done with youngsters is done with true sincerity, so Memela, this will have an impact on the mechanchim as well, on the educators, that it will involve them as well, also in all of these inyanim and all these areas of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasad. Then the Rebbe continued that in this week's Sedra, when it comes to today's Parsha, the Parsha of Shvi, we find regarding the Chatzar Oyel Moyed, the yard of the Oyel Moyed. And this comes, the Rebbe says, after the Sedra has told us in detail, about the erection of the Aron and the Menorah and the Shulchan, all of these which were major inyanim in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mishkan. Now comes an inyan of Chatzar Oyel Moed. What's the inyan of Chatzar Oyel Moed? Actually, it was a yard, a part of the Midbar. And this part of the Midbar no longer remained Midbar, but it was converted and became it was uplifted and it became part of a yard of the Oyel Moed, part of the Mishkan. This, in other words, Rebbe tied in to the inyan of Kol Ma'asecha L'Shem Shamayim and Bechol D'Rochecha De'eyu. How a Yid is bekoyach that all the inyanim he comes into contact with, all the gashmistic inyanim that he comes into day-to-day dealing with, have to be uplifted and purified, and everything has to be utilized for the Rebishta, for Kedusha. And again, we have general inyanim and we have detailed inyanim. We have general inyanim like we just spoke, these inyanim that a child has to have, his own chumash, his own siddur, his own pushka. These are inyanim klali. Then there are inyanim prati, and detailed inyanim. For example, in the day-to-day life of a person, we also have the same. First, as soon as a person gets up, the first thing which we say is Moida ani lefanecha. This is a general declaration of dedication to the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is in a general format. Then when a person gets thirsty and wants to take a drink, it's not enough that he said Moida ani lefanecha in the morning. He has to go ahead, if we're talking about a Yid has to go ahead and recite a bracha which expresses Shahakol Niyah B'Dvarei, that everything was created through the Rebishta. Rabbi says a guy doesn't have to recite the bracha, but a guy also understands that there is a master and a creator to the world, and that everything is channeled through him. And the same we find regarding all of the inyanim. There are detailed inyanim which are demanded from each and every one of us. As the general terminology would be the miftzayim. So there are detailed miftzayim, and we have to try and fulfill all of them. Right now we are before Purim. So not only are there the general miftzayim, we also have to see to it to fulfill the miftzayim of Purim. In other words, the Rebbe is explaining that though there are general inyanim, which seem to us in Yonim Kloliyim that these are primary in Yonim, but nonetheless we are not allowed to give up and do away with other inyanim which seem to us that they are just little details, and perhaps we may say we are involved in such big inyanim, these little details don't count, so it's not so. The Rebbe mentioned for an example. We're talking about somebody who's involved, heavily involved in davening, and his davening takes. And this same person comes to recite the Yom, the daily Yom which we recite. So one will say to himself, what difference is it if he's accurate in reciting the Yom, if he's saying the right Yom of the day, or he doesn't say the Yom altogether. He will look on it that this is a detailed thing, it doesn't carry much weight, it doesn't carry much relevance. So the Rebbe says it is not so. And the same thing we got to see to it to fulfill the Shiurim of Chitas. All the detailed inyanim, we are responsible to do them at the same time that and the same way we are responsible to do all the general and basic inyanim. All inyanim have to be taken care of, and all inyanim have to be fulfilled. To conclude the Sikha, the Rebbe always concludes that with the expression that it would be Hikitzu v'rananu sheikh neyafa, that everybody who we're talking about, including Moshe Rabbeinu, will all wake up with the coming of Mashiach, and when Mashiach will come, he will answer all questions. Rebbe says he will also answer this question. The Rambam tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote 13 Torahs, 13 Sefer Torahs on the day that he passed away. It's according to one opinion. Others who don't hold this opinion still hold that Moshe Rabbeinu concluded a Sefer Torah the day that he passed away, the day that he was nifter. The Torah finishes with the word La'einei Kol Yisrael. And the Lamet of Yisrael, the Rebbe says, is a Lamet Rapsai, which means it's a big letter in the Torah. In the Torah we know there are regular sized letters, and there's some letters which are big letters. The Lamet of La'einei Kol Yisrael is a big letter, regular letter, larger than the ordinary letters in the Sefer Torah. Mela, the Rebbe says. Regarding Shabbos, the halacha is, if one writes 2 letters, it's considered writing on Shabbos. Transgressing Shabbos is by writing 2 letters. But it says, could be, if he writes 1 letter that's the size of 2, it's also considered like he wrote 2 letters. Mainly here we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, the La'einei Kol Yisrael. If the Lamet is a Lamet Rapsai, it's a large letter, it's the size of 2. On the other hand, we know that why do we recite Tzidkos Tzedek by Mincha Shabbos afternoon? Because there were 3 tzaddikim that passed away Shabbos afternoon. One of them being Moshe Rabbeinu. So on one hand we say that Moshe passed away Shabbos afternoon, on Shabbos. And on the other hand we say that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Sefer Torahs on the day that he passed away, wrote or completed regardless. But nonetheless, he wrote Sefer Torahs. How was he able to write when it was on a Shabbos? The Rebbe says when Mashiach will come and he will answer all the questions, all kashas which we have in Torah, he will also answer this question regarding the writing of Moshe Rabbeinu on the day that he passed away. As it's customary in the Farbrengens, the Rebbe raises some questions and Rashis in the Sedra. Today, the Rebbe raised a few questions in the beginning of the Sedra. Torah tells us that the Rebbe told Moshe, go ahead, talk to the Yidden, v'yikchu li Terumah, and that the Yidden should take Terumah, should give a contribution. Everybody should contribute for the erection of the Mishkan. So the Torah lists several things, what the contributions could have been from. Gold, silver, copper. Then we come to Pasuk Dalet. Pasuk Dalet tells us Treles, Argomon, Terla Shoni, V'Sheish, V'Izim. What does Rashi comment on the word Sheish? What does Sheish mean? Sheish means Pishton.
Of course, English.
Okay. Rebbe says the question is a very obvious one. When we learn Chumash, obviously the first time that the word Sheish would be mentioned, that is when Rashi should comment what Sheish means. we look back, take a concredencia, we will look up the word sheish, we will see that the word sheish was already mentioned in the Torah. Where? By Yosef. When Yosef was put on the clothing by Paroi, beautiful clothing, which he gave him, the Torah tells us that what he was wearing was big day sheish. And Rashi there does not comment anything what sheish means. Why is it over here that Rashi does comment what sheish is? Also, if we go a little bit further, Rashi explains what does troshim mean. So Rashi says there's a certain animal, that animal was only around at that time, and that animal is called tachash. And why was the tachash used for the erection of the Mishkan? Rashi tells us that the tachash has beautiful colors. And that is what the Targum also tells us, shesos. The Targum teaches the word tachash, sasgoina. Sasgoina meaning shesos umispoir, that this animal is very happy and proud of the beautiful colors that it has. Why does Rashi have to tell us what the Targum says about something? This is not Rashi's inyan. Rashi is quoting a Targum and explaining a Targum. Not just is he quoting the Targum, but he's explaining it. Then if we go weiter, Argomon, or rather, before that, the pasuk uses the word argomon. Argomon normally would mean purple. So what does Rashi teach? Tzemer tzavua, it was wool, which was a dyed wool, mimin tzeva, from a certain type of color, sheshmoi argomon, that is called argomon. The truth is, if we look into other mefarshei HaTorah, we will see how do they comment argomon, how do they explain the word argomon. So in Even Ezra and in other mefarshim, we find that they explain argomon. Argomon is a red. It's a kind of a shade of red. And Rashi, it seems like ignores it. And Rashi tells us that it means something else. It's called argomon, but Rashi doesn't explain what it is. But what we do see from Rashi is that Rashi is staying away from learning that it's a color that leans to red, as Even Ezra and other mefarshim learn. Then we have another Rashi. The Torah here tells us that the Yidden contributed atzei shittim, which is wood. So Rashi asks a very strong question. How did the Yidden have lumber when they were in the desert? Where did they get it from? So Rashi goes on, Pirish Rab Tanchume. So Rab Tanchume explains, Yaakov Avinu tzofa beruach HaKodesh. Our father Yaakov foresaw with Ruach HaKodesh Sha'asidin Yisrael livnois Mishkan b'midbar, that it will come a time when the Yidden will build a Mishkan in the Midbar. So what did he do? Hevi arozim leMitzrayim. He brought cedars to Egypt, trees. V'notam, and he planted them there. V'tziva lebanov, and he commanded the children, litla mimohem, they should take it along with him, kishayetzu miMitzrayim, when they will go out of Egypt. Very strange Rashi. Rashi quotes whom? A Medrash Tanchume. But obviously it's not just a Medrash. Rashi says Rabbi Tanchume. It's a quotation in the name of Rabbi Tanchume. Usually we know that even when Rashi does quote a Tana in an opinion on a pasuk, Rashi does not mention his name unless it has a relevance to the inyan. We should know who said it. Another thing, when Rashi does quote a Medrash, he usually would use the expression Dorash Rab Tanchume. It's a drash. Pirish means it's a pshat. We know there's pshat and there's drush. True, normally Rashi tries to stick to the realm of pshat, but wherever, for whatever reason, Rashi has to come on to a drash, Rashi quotes a drash. So Rashi then would use the expression Dorash Rab Tanchume. No, Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says Pirish Rabbi Tanchume. To understand all of this, Rebbe says, the Yidden here are in a wilderness, in the Midbar, and they are told by the Rebishter that they have to make certain contributions for the Mishkan. So the question is, where do they have these things from? How do they have these things? So when we learned that they have Zahav, V'chesef. This is no question. They had it from Mitzrayim. There's no doubt in our mind where did they get all these things? Because they had it in Mitzrayim. Now the question becomes, we are learning, for example, that they had Argoma. What does Argoma mean? So Rashi has to tell you what Argoma means. What is it? So Rashi says you should know it's a wool. Where they had wool from, again, there's no question. Why is it no question? Because they had their cattle that they took along with them. As we read in the Torah, they had sheep which they took with them. V'meila, they were able to have wool. This is something which a child understands. So Rashi tells us what Argoma is. Why Rashi does not learn like Even Ezra that Argoma is a shade of red? This the Rebbe says is very simple. Because let us look into Pasuk Hey. The Pasuk says specifically that there was skin which was dyed red. So if we're already talking about which means red, we can't learn that Argoma means red. So that's why Rashi does not tell us what color Argoma is, but regardless, he should know it's something which, a certain color, irrelevant what the color is, but red it can't be, which was dyed on the wool of behemoths. What's the matter? Okay. Then the question comes, V'sheish. Sheish means fine linen. So again, in Bereishis, there is no need for Rashi to explain what sheish it means, because Rashi is explaining when the question arises for needed an explanation. The pasuk there is describing the garments which Yosef wore. It's irrelevant to us to know the details of the garment. We knew he was a Mitzrayim, and any type of garment that he wanted, he could have gotten, or Pari could have given him. Just like, the Rebbe says, just like the pasuk doesn't explain where the Merkeves HaMishnah, the wagon, which was used for Yosef. There's no explanation, a detailed explanation what type of wagon it was, whether it was a wagon that had 4 wheels or 6 wheels, or other details describing the wagon. Why? Because in Mitzrayim you get any type of wagon. You need a garment, you need a beautiful garment for somebody who was appointed to be a Mishnah Lamelech, like Yosef, so you use Bigdei Sheish, which is whatever type of fabric, a beautiful fabric, which is suitable for that type of a garment which was needed for Yosef. However, here we are in the midbar, so the question that's bothering the child, where do we get sheish from, and what does sheish mean? Sheish means linen. Where do we get linen in the midbar? So that is why Rashi has to tell us what it is. Maybe the child could understand that perhaps it was taken along from Mitzrayim, or perhaps the Yidden had an opportunity. We also know that the Yidden were, while they were traveling in the Midbar, they were not too far from other nations. And there were travelers, there were Tagrim, there were merchants that were traveling in the Midbar, so the Yidden may have had an opportunity to buy it from them. Now when it comes to Tachash, Rashi is explaining why was there a need for a Tachash in the Mishkan. So being that we know that the Mishkan was made l'chaved u'l'sefaras. In other words, the Mishkan had to be beautiful. There was a stress for beauty when the Mishkan was erected. So that is why Rashi tells us you should know this Tachash is a Chayeh that possesses within itself beautiful colors, a tremendous amount of beauty. And in Mela, you were able to use it. And if you use the Tachash, it came in very handy to the Mishkan. So that is why Rashi Taka quotes the Targum and explains what Targum means. Why? Because Rashi is out to give us a full picture. Why was there a need of a Tachash to the erection of the Mishkan? Now that we know that Targum explains that Tachash means Sasgoina. And why does it mean Sasgoina? Because it stems from the word shasos. It is happy. It has a tremendous happiness that it has such beautiful colors. And for the erection of the Mishkan, there was a need on all of these beautiful colors. The Rebbe also mentioned, interesting, that regarding Argomon, which is mentioned here in the Torah, there is a Ravid. The Rambam and the Ravid usually argues on the Rambam. And the Ravid explains that Argomon means something which is weaved from several colors. That's what Argomon means. But Rashi obviously does not want to accept this pirush. Why? Because why go to Argomon, something which is weaved from several, to learn that Argomon is like the Ravid learns, something which is weaved from several colors, when we have a Tachash who naturally possesses a beautiful selection of colorful colors that can contribute much more than we should learn that Argomon means a weave of several colors together. So Mamela Rashi does not learn like the Even Ezra that learns that that Argomon means red. He also does not learn like the Ravid that Argomon means a multicolor weave, because the multicolor we rather get it from the Tachash than getting it from a weave which people have to put their heads in and put together colors. It's much nicer, there's much more beauty when it comes from the Tachash. Now what we still have to understand is the Rashi of Pirish Rabbi Tanchuma. Rabbi learns as follows. When the Yidden were in the Midbar, this came as a continuation to Golus Mitzrayim. When they were in Mitzrayim, the Yidden were broken. On one hand, they are told that this is a Golus, which they're going to be taken out of. On the other hand, Paro is saying, every Jewish child that's born has to be thrown into the river, to the Nile. So this had a terrible impact on the people. People became very broken. Why are you telling us that there's going to be an end to this Golus? How could there be an end to such a Golus? So Rashi is telling us, Pirish Rabbi Tanchuma. There's a Pirish from whom? From somebody by the name of Tanchuma, Rab Tanchuma. What does Tanchuma mean? Nichum, condolence. His whole inyan was to give strength, to give courage to the Yidden, that the Yidden should be able to hold. This whole Pirush is based on the concept of giving strength and courage to Yidden, that the Yidden should be able to hold out in Golus Mitzrayim. So they are told that Yaakov Avinu, hundreds of years ago, so over a few hundred years, saw Beruach HaKodesh. What's going to happen? And Memele Yaakov took along these trees and planted them in Mitzrayim and told his children, with the intention that his children should relate it to their children, that these trees, these cedar trees, should be taken out with them when they'll go out from Mitzrayim. What does this give? This gives a source of strength and hope that the Golus will take an end. And we will be going out of Golus. Because if Yaakov Avinu, hundreds of years ago, took along these woods, this lumber, this type of lumber with him, and prepared it, this gives a tremendous koyach that the Yidden should have an emunah, should have belief that they will go out of Mitzvah. The same the Rebbe says is regarding us in the Golus which we are in now. It's banim shagalu mishulchan avim, children that have been chased away, we have been driven away from our father's table. And it's more than 1900 years that we are in Golus. And we are in need of this Rabbi Tanchuma. We need a nichumin, we need a condolence for the fact that we weren't taken out of Golus yet. Because ad Mosai, how much longer will we be in Golus? And Yidden have to demand from the Rebishter that the Rebishter should take us out of Golus. It's enough that we are in Golus. And here the Rebbe related the famous episode between the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and his son, the Rebbe Marash. That the Rebbe Marash once came to his father, the Tzemach Tzedek, and he told him that it is written in the Mamorim of the Alter Rebbe on a certain year, that year is a Kates. A Kates meaning it's a year which is set aside for Geula. Because Mashiach will come on that year. And how come Mashiach didn't come? So his father, the Tzemach Tzedek, told him a tremendous thing happened in that year. That was the year that the Likutei Torah was printed. Likutei Torah is compiled Mamorim from the Alter Rebbe and the Svarim of Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. So the Tzemach Tzedek was satisfied himself with the fact that the Likutei Torah was printed on that year. So the son, the Rebbe Marash, told him, no, this is not enough. What we need is, we need Mashiach b'poyel mamish. We cannot satisfy ourselves with spiritual satisfactions that we have the L'Kutei Torah. What we need is Mashiach Shetake come. The same the Rebbe says, who was the one that demanded it? From his father, from his Rebbe. It was the Rebbe Marash. As we know, the Rebbe Marash is the one whose view in everything is L'Katchila Rebbe, above and beyond. Memele, he realized and demanded and insisted from his father that we must have Mashiach B'Poyel Mamish. Because when we go with an approach of L'Katchila Rebbe, not L'Katchila Runter, and the saying, quotation of the Rebbe Marash goes as follows: The Welt sagt, the world says, "Am ken nicht darunter, geht man a Rebbe." If we can't go under, that is when we go over. Und ich sag, and I say, the Rebbe Marash continued, "Am darf gehen L'Katchila Rebbe." We go right away over. The Mele, Rebbe says, when we go with a hanocha, when we go with an approach, not wie the Welt, but the approach of the Rebbe Marash. The Rebbe Marash's approach is that we have to go look at Chila Rebbe. That is when we demand that we must have Mashiach. The other Rebbe says, Gemara tells us it's Kolu Kol HaKitzin. All the Kitzin have passed already. All the times, years that we have indications for Gula have already passed. And it's only up to the Rebishter that the Rebishter should send Mashiach and take us all out of Golos. Here the Rebbe quoted that there's a halacha, that when the Rebishter promises something, if it's l'toiv, if it's to the good, he has no right to regret on that. He can't call it back. Memela, the Rebishter promised that there will be an union of Giyula. The Rebishter pledging Giyula, therefore we must make sure that Giyula comes. And Geula happens. And it must be with Mashiach B'Poyel Mamish. And this is the, getting back to Rab Tanchume, this is the Indian of Rab Tanchume. Tanchume Meloshen Nichumin. It's Meloshen condolence. In other words, he's condoling Yidden, consolation, giving consolation to Yidden, that we should be able to hold out in Golas until the Geula will come. And the same, this was in that Golas, and the same is in the Golas which we are in right now. Also in the Indian, in the Shir HaRambam, which the Rebbe learns today, a few explanations in Rambam, in Hilchis Tefillah, as well as in Hilchis Tefillin. First of all, the Rebbe raised a few questions in the beginning in the Rambam of Hilchis Tefillah, where the Rambam tells us how it's a mitzvah's esa on everyone to daven daily. And we daven when we have a bakashas rochav. In other words, when we have something which we need, we request it from the Rabbeinu Shalom. So the Rebbe raised a few questions in this inyan. What is the meaning that we daven daily? And what means bakashas rochav, a person davens when he needs something? And it built up a question. He says, what do we mean when a person needs something? There are certain people who may not need anything. He says, if somebody who has a rich father-in-law, and his father-in-law undertook to support him, so this person has whatever he wants. And if he's missing something, he turns to his father-in-law and he says, this is the arrangement we made, that you will provide me, I'm marrying your daughter, and you will provide me with whatever only needed. So where is there bakashas rochav by such an individual? And what does it mean that we have to daven daily? Because the pasuk says, "V'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem," you will serve the Rebishter. There are inyanim which we don't do daily. There are inyanim which come from time to time. To mention just one of them, the Rebbe mentioned the inyan of Kiddush Levana. When are we mechadish the Levana? Once a month. When we see the new moon and the proper date, that is when we say Kiddush Levana. Basically, what the Rebbe answered here was that regardless, every person does have his needs. Even there are requests for health, there are requests for other inyanim, so there's always a bakashas rochav to ask for the Rebishter. And regarding every day, Rebbe stressed there are certain inyanim take which come from time to time, And just like we know that the Rebbe cares for our needs on a daily basis, quoted this or a similar expression. In the same way, it is our davening to the Rebbe also has to be done on a daily basis. And the Rambam, after the halachas of tefillah, comes also the halachas of duchening, nesiyas kapayim, which are koyin duchos. At the end of Hilchas Nesiyas Kapayim, the Rambam tells us as follows: Kol koyin she'eino oilo leduchen, any koyin which is not duchen, afal pi shebitel mitzvahs esa achas, even though he was mevatel one mitzvahs essay, harezet is considered ka'over al sholish esed, as if he was over on 3 mitzvahs essay. Shenema koyisavochos b'nei Yisrael amoyel lehem v'samu l'shmi. Then the Rambam concludes: Chol koyin she'eino mevarech eino mizborech. Any koyin that doesn't bench is not being benched himself. V'chol koyin hamevarech mizborech. And every koyin that does give brachas is being blessed himself. Shenema v'avolcha mevarchecha. The Rebbe says, I will bless those who bless you. The source of these last words in the Rambam is in the Gemara. But interesting, in the Gemara it says different. The Gemara says, Kol koyin hamevarech mizborech. Every koyin that gives a bracha gets a bracha. Kol koyin she'eina mevarech eina mizbarech. That's right. The Rambam reverses the Seder. Rambam mentions first the koyin who doesn't bench is not being benched, and then he says the one who benches is being benched. Why does the Rambam change from the Gemara? So simply we can say that the intention of the Rambam is, but being that with this halacha the Rambam concludes the halachas of tefillah, the halachas of nesiyas kapayim, we know that the Rambam always wants to be a misayim b'toiv. He wants to finish with something good. So rather than finishing with eina mizbarech, he would rather finish with mizbarech, the one who is being blessed. The Rebbe says it's more than that. If we look into the Gemara there says other penalties on the koyin who does not give a bracha. The Rambam does not mention it. The Gemara says, Rahman al the kohen who does not give a bracha. The Gemara says, his years are shortened, Rahman al The Rambam doesn't mention that. Why? It seems that the Rambam holds that lahalacha, it is not so. What is lahalacha? Kol koyin she'eino mevarech eino mizbarech. What does this mean? What does it mean he's not blessed if he doesn't give a bracha? Because the halacha tells us that anybody that's in shul is part of the Birchas Kohen. Then the Gemara says, Amshe besodos, people who couldn't make it to shul, people who are in the fields, they're at home, they live in villages and small townlets and they couldn't come to shul. So the Gemara says that these Amshe besodos are also included in the Birchas Kohen. So the Rambam says, everybody is included in the Birchas Kohen. Who is the exception that is not included in the Birchas Kohanim? It's the koyin she'eino mevarech. The koyin she'eino mevarech, what does he get for that? Being that he does not give a bracha to others, eino mizbarech, he is also not part of the bracha which is being given by the kohanim. So the Rebbe raised the question, what would the case be if a koyin who was unwillingly did not go to duchen? For example, he didn't make it to wash his hands on time, and we know that he has to be by ritzei. He has to already be ready for the duchening, and he wasn't ready, or he didn't have a chance to wash his hand in time. So Mamela, he can't go to duchen. So obviously, he goes into the category of a kol koyin she'eino mevarech. Shekol koyin she'eino mevarech, the Rambam says, he is Einu mizbarech, then he cannot be part of the Birchas Kohanim, which is given at that time in shul. Other Yidden, even though they are not there, are still mizbarchim. As the Gemara says, Amshe besodos gets a bracha. However, this individual, being that he's Einu mevarech, is Einu mizbarech. However, Kol Koyin ha-mevarech, the Koyin that does give bracha, he is mizbarech, he gets a special bracha from the Rebishter, Shenema va'avolcha mevarechech. After Hilchis Tefillah and Duchening, we come to the halachas of Tefillin. The Rambam has a custom But before he begins the halachas, he always details how many mitzvahs asay and mitzvahs lois asay are involved in these particular halachas. So when we go to Hilchas Tefillin, the Rambam tells us there are 5 mitzvahs asay that are involved here. What are they? Liyos tefillin ala rosh. We should wear tefillin on our heads, and then lekashram ala yad, to tie them on our hand. Let us think for a moment. What do we put on first? Head or hand? Why does the Rambam change the schedule? What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, "Ukshartom lois al yodecha, v'hoyu l'tetafes beinenecha." Furthermore, there is a halacha that we are not allowed to wear kol zman shehein bein. In other words, when we have the shel rosh on, we also have to have the shel yad on. So the Rambam, based on all this, the Rambam should have definitely counted shel yad first and then shel rosh. So the Rambam tells us no. L'yois tefillin ala rosh is first, and what is second? L'kashram ala yad. Why? It's like 2 separate mitzvahs. But why does the Rambam do this? To count the rosh before yad. So this the Rebbe explained in a Lomdische explanation based on a explanation of the Ragachava, who explains that there is a major difference between tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh. Difference is as follows. The Rebbe related it briefly, but he says the Ragachava in his commentary elaborates on it. The Ragachava introduces this concept. He says as follows: tefillin shel rosh is a mitzvah to wear. Tefillin shel yad is a mitzvah to put on. The mitzvah is to put it on. Tefillin shel rosh, the mitzvah is to wear it. The Rebbe always mentions such type of thought. He always likes to bring it down into an actual difference. What is the difference between tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh? I mean, we have to put on both of them, obviously. You can't wear it unless you put it on. So how do we understand this difference between shel yad and shel rosh? Rebbe says very simple. If somebody would go and put on tefillin while it is still dark, puts on tefillin so early that it is still night, the halacha is that his shel rosh he can remain wearing. His shel yad, he has to be memashmesh. He has to touch it, kind of, which is considered like putting it on again. He has to make some movement around it, which would be credited as if he put it on again once a turn day. What do we derive from this? That we come to another concept. There's a concept in halacha of todir, meaning something which is constant. Todir, u'she'einoi todir, todir koidem. Something which is constant and something which is temporary, the one who is constant has preference. Especially in those days, they would wear tefillin all day. Now we don't. But in the day of the Gemara, they would wear tefillin all day. Here we come to a major difference between shel yad and shel rosh. Shel yad is not a todir. All we have to do as far as shel yad is to put it on. Shel rosh is a todir. Shel rosh is an inyan in wearing shel rosh. Todir, v'she'einei todir, todir koidem. That is why, when it comes to count the preference, the seder, the sequence of these mitzvahs, the Rambam counts first liyos tefillin ala rosh, then he counts the second mitzvah is also in tefillin, but that's the tefillin shel yad of lekashram ala yad tayit. In other words, by shel yad the mitzvah is the hanocha, the putting it on. By shel rosh it's not only a temporary thing of putting on, which is something which takes a minute. There's an inyan in wearing a shel rosh. Memela the Rambam learns first is an inyan liyos tefillin ala rosh, and nach dem comes the second inyan of lekashram ala yad. The Maimah, something interesting. Maimah was also based on the pasuk v'yikhu li Terumah, and again stressing the inyan of v'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'soicham. And here's where the Rebbe said the inyan which we mentioned before of b'soich kol echad ve'echad. not only b'seich kol echad ve'echad, but means b'seich kol echad ve'achas, right? So the Rebbe mentioned that the Maimer, which he's saying, is a Maimer based on a Maimer from the Friedrich Rebbe of Tafshin Dalet, 1944. The Rebbe says the reason he always mentions the source of the Maimer, which he says, is not to show Bikiyas, it's not to show off where he's quoting from. Because it's no big thing, says it's not in the need of showing off. He says, prepares a Maimer, and this is what he says over, and he doesn't say over the whole Maimer, says over certain parts of it. The Kudais, briefings of the Maimer. The reason that he mentions it, he says, is that we should hear where the Maimer is taken from, and when we hear where it's taken from, so we all have access to these Svarim. And Melee, after the Farbrengen, we could all go and look up the Maimer and learn through the Maimer on our own, and be able to ourselves to look into the Maimer and to learn the Maimer. You know, the Rebbe didn't mention it, but now when I was looking into the Rambam, it's very, maybe the Rogatchover stresses it, it's very obvious here in the Rambam. The Rambam changes the Lashon. The Rambam uses the expression Liois Tvilin ala Rosh. He doesn't say Lahaniach. And when it comes to Shel Yad, he stresses Lekashchom ala Yatzim. The mitzvah is the Lekashchom.
But don't you have the same? But the din that we said before is you can't have the tefillin Shel Rosh.
That's Habazun the Halach.
Yeah, but that it's showing. But
this is
the
Emes.
tefillin Shel Yad is also constant because it has to be on.
That's a good point.
That's what I'm trying to say.
I hear what you're saying.
It's a constant.
In other words, you can't have the Rosh without the Yad.
Right, so then the Yad is constant.
What about a person who has some?
So that was an exception.
Yeah, but I'm saying
That it could be found. Okay.
Also, if the film show Rosh is Tadir, so Yad is Tadir.
Yes.
Why do we put on the show Yad first?
Because we now are bound with a halacha that we can't wear the shal. This is what we're discussing now. We can't wear the shal rosh alone. That's why we take off the shal rosh first also. Because kolzman sheir beinenecha, kolzman sheheim beinenecha, the Gemara says you shnai. As long as we have the shal rosh, we have to wear both. So that's why we put it on the shal rosh last, and we take it off first. All for this reason.
Why does the bracha of Lahanech Tefillin go on the Rosh without saying? Why don't we have to make another bracha? Since one is for the putting on, for the Yad is putting on, and for the
Why don't we make
the
a
Rosh?
separate bracha? Being that they are done together there. This is already a thing which is discussed in Shulchan Aruch. There's some
Maybe that's
people
why,
that can make
most everybody except Lubavitch, they do make
makes two brachas, and we don't, because it's one mitzvah in the same contents. It's being fulfilled at the same time, so we're being engaged with one bracha.
No, I was jumping about it here. The fact that because of the fact that Adomim is referring to red, that's referring to behemoths. But when you're dealing before here, it's two different categories. This is dealing with
So the Manisha. I thought of what he's saying. But if Argomon would mean red, then in the same pasuk, you wouldn't, the same sequence of psukim, you wouldn't refer to red once Argomon and once more Damis. You'd use the same expression. Right, here you're talking about wool, and here you're talking about skin, about Oirisalem. You're right as far as that. You're talking about different objects. But if you're referring with a color, if this is the definition of the color, and the main is something in the red family, as Evan Ezra learns, Viotatam and Argomon you call red, and Mudamim is roy. It's a steer. So Rashi says, I don't know what color it is. Call it whatever color you want, but it's something which was weaved on the wool.